Hello and welcome to Mandibil. Excuse me, there's a little frog in my throat. And this is part 12 of my deconstruction of Stefan Molyneux's book, Essential Philosophy, How to Know What on Earth is Going On. And last time we dealt with the chapter called Objectivity and Honesty. And I pointed out an aspect that was sort of prevalent in his I believe possibly in all of his so-called writing, which is that he always or seems to very often needs to bring some third party in a sort of sophist way, you could say, right? It's like when he says objectivity and honesty, it's like it creates at least it attempts or could potentially create the notion that he is on the objectivity side and there might be somebody who are not honest, and that's why we have a problem. So I don't need to put too much focus on philosophizing and presenting my philosophy on objectivity, rather point out those who are not honest about objectivity or something like that, right? So it creates a constant approach to trench warfare rather than what I would maybe call pure philosophy, where he just presents his thinking. And when you have a good metaphysics, right, you will inevitably end up in a notion of I will speak from my own thinking point of view, right? And before I established what it means, what does honesty mean? Well, you have to possibly define objectivity before you can talk about honesty, right? Now, I don't exactly remember what the last chapter was. Let's just look on the senses. Yeah, right. That was the senses. And now we're talking about objectivity and honesty. So it's like, okay, he is using the definition and then comparing it to something that actually needs that definition before you can talk about that thing, in this case, honesty. And it's this sort of lame kind of argument, it's sort of it's an agenda-driven kind of philosophy, right? Which is another way of saying sophistry. There's a purpose with things here. It's not pure philosophy. It's agenda-driven philosophy. You have to constantly be reminded what is the purpose of our goal. We need to, right? But it just violates the foundations of good philosophy. As I said before, objectivity or honesty needs an idea of what objectivity is. So you can't talk about objectivity unless you have sort of defined what you mean by objectivity based on, the reduction backwards towards your foundation of metaphysics. And honesty would be sort of not saying the opposite of what you experience when comparing to a proposition. If I say that's an elephant, you're not going to say that's false if you experience an elephant. That would be a way to define honesty. But objectivity, what is that? Is objectivity that I experience the elephant, or is objectivity that I have established an agreement with another person about that object? But that doesn't mean that I'm necessarily myself is honest, unless I want to be honest. It would be stupid for me to lie if I want to establish honest interaction between me and another individual. So it's not exactly completely crazy, maybe, right? But it's not good philosophy, in my opinion. It's just, it's sort of left hand. He's just, it's like he's just said, I'm going to write this book about essential philosophy, and everything that sort of pops into my mind, I'm going to write that because that must be important because, right? It's like, it's not thought through. It's not coherent. At least not enough for me to take it seriously, right? And then it's called essential philosophy. It's not called philosophy, right? So it's like it's the very short introduction to sort of kind of book, right? and it's not, and there are millions of these books possibly, right? Or blog posts about what is philosophy about, right? Then there's no big news in this one. If anything, it's more like an insult to good philosophy, in my opinion, right? Somebody who has not grappled with philosophy for a very long time will not be helped by using Essential Philosophy, this book. So, okay, I highlighted a few things, and it's been a little while, so maybe I'm not quite sharp exactly on what these highlights, why I made them, but let's see how it goes, right? Something that looks wet to me, if it really does, is an honest statement. Yeah, but that was again, if it really does. What is really does, right? What is really does? If that looks wet to me, then I have to check, does it really look wet? Well, if I just experience it as wet, he just said that up here, right? He said, it looks wet to me, right? Isn't that wet? I mean, you can't experience it being wet and then ask yourself the question, does it look wet? Well, you just said it looks wet, right? What does it mean that it really does? Do I have to look even closer, even approach the object? Or what does that mean, right? When is it enough? Again, these matters of degree can never be anything like knowledge, right? Objectivity must be a certain kind of knowledge, in my opinion, right? Or a certain categorization of prior knowledge, or present knowledge, maybe you should say, right? Or potentially future knowledge. You could say that we are agreeing to meet at the Eiffel Tower in a month, right? Then there's an object called the Eiffel Tower, and then there's a time in the future where we are going to have objectivity together at the same time around this particular object. So that would be a future plan of objectivity, you could say. Well, I mean, you could maybe bend it a little, right? But, but saying that something, it looks wet to me, right? That looks wet to me. If it really does, well, what is the really does? Do I have to go away and come back and look at it again? And that's how, okay, now it really does. What do I do to get to really does? It's like, okay, it looks wet, but that's not good enough, according to Stefan Molyneux, right? So if it really does, well, where I'm going to get really does from? Should I just look again? And look again and again and again, and then at some point when I looked 7 times maybe, now I know it's an honest statement to say that it's wet. But I can't refer to it at all as being wet unless I'm experiencing it to be wet. It's this thing that this bad metaphysics, it creeps up everywhere, right? If you get metaphysics wrong, as I say, you get everything else wrong, because everything is based on your metaphysical understanding of your experience, right? And what you have access to, and what you do not have access to, and what you have access to sometimes and not always, and so on. These things has to be settled very clearly and strictly, right? So, okay, so if it looks wet, then if it really does, what it really does, right? If I'm looking at something, at stone, maybe over there, or the pavement or something like that, right? It looks wet. Okay, it looks wet. Okay, so I just experienced that it looks red. How do I upgrade it to really does look wet? I'm just going to stare at it until some point in the future where I can say, okay, now I've been watching it for 10 minutes. Now it's really wet, right? It's just like, well, the world changes constantly, right? The sun breaks out and dries the pavement, and now it's no longer wet. There I was sitting waiting to get really wet, right? Or that it really does look wet. So it's just not how people work. If something looks wet, you just accept it as looking wet, because that's what your mind just told you it is looking wet. Whether or not it really is wet, whatever that might mean, doesn't matter, because you have no way of upgrading it to other than looking wet as you just experienced the first time, right? In the first moment that you experienced wet. So he's appealing to a higher level of insight that can sort of validate your first sort of impression, right? The first impression. But there is no access to such a fantastic, intrinsic, objective realm that you can tap into. There is nothing else, right? The only thing you have are your inductions or memories in your mind of prior experiences of the same kind of experience. But that is not reality. That is particularly something in your mind, or you could call it reality, if your inner complete picture of the world. But that is not the thing itself, was what I actually meant, right? The thing itself is that which your experience potentially is based on, which you do not have access to. Otherwise, you wouldn't need the experience of it, right? Okay. Saying that something is wet just because it looks wet to me is a hypothesis. No, yeah, but if it looks wet, right? When you're saying it looks wet, you could say you are making a proposition of a kind, right? You could discuss whether or not it's knowledge. I would not call wet knowledge, but because a lot of things can be wet. So it doesn't give you any you could say maybe information to say that it's wet. It's more important that it's a rock or an elephant or a bicycle, right? You could point and say wet, right? Just say point and say wet, and then somebody else could look in that same direction from their standpoint, right? And look in the same way and say, I agree that it's wet, but the wet is not something that brings enough information with it. If it was instead like that bicycle is wet, right? So if you say that's a bicycle, well, then you're pointing indirectly to the bicycle which is wet, right? So it could be, it's a sort of maybe a fluffy ground, right? Because it's interesting that it's wet because it's the bicycle that is wet. But if you have no other information than that is wet, then the wetness doesn't really matter, right? It's because the wetness is on an object which actually has importance to you, right? If the road is wet in front of you driving a car, you drive more safely, you could say, right? So the wetness has importance for an object which you are in some way or another interacting with, right? Then it becomes valuable to you to have that insight. We could discuss whether it's knowledge. I would say that the road is knowledge and the car is knowledge, but the wetness is not knowledge, because wetness in itself alone is an attribute, you could say, that all kinds of objects can have, right? Okay, so why is that it's a hypothesis? I don't think that's an hypothesis. If you say that rock is wet, right? Something is wet is how it is. Saying that something is wet. Okay, that rock is wet, right? You're pointing. It looks wet to me. No, so he's saying that it's wet because it looks wet is a hypothesis. I'm just having a hypothesis that is looking wet. No, it's not a hypothesis. It's a different kind of thing, right? You have an experience, and you can't just pretend that you're not having the experience, right? If it looks wet, then it looks wet, right? You have no way of checking whether or not it should be looking wet, because that's how your mind tells you. That's what the mind tells you about that part of your experience. It's basically saying on some kind of automated pilot that's wet, right? And you're not deciding for it to be wet, right? It's not a hypothesis. I'm going to have the hypothesis that is wet. Well, you couldn't talk about it being wet if you didn't have the experience that it's wet. And at the same time, you have no way of knowing whether or not you should be experiencing that wetness, no matter what you do after a while having the experience, right? So if it looks wet, it looks wet. Done. There's nothing more to do, right? In my opinion, it's not a hypothesis, right? If I see water drops from my window and I say that I see water drops on my window, I am telling the truth. Yeah, telling the truth. Well, when you're telling it's a sort of figure of speech, right? So I would grant that, of course, but I would say that you can't tell the truth. I mean, I understand what he's saying, right? If you make a proposition about your experience, and your proposition is in concordance with your experience, then that proposition, that there is truth in, it's a figure of speech, right? If you say that the proposition is true, the proposition isn't necessarily true. It can also be false. There's nothing that is true or false implicitly about a proposition. If I say that's an elephant, that proposition can either be true or false. Well, and if I say that proposition is true, well, it's true in the moment when I said it, but it might as well be false for somebody else. So there's it's compared to my experience. While I have that experience, that proposition is true to me. So it's sort of, truth is conclusion about the comparison, and as soon as you have made the comparison, the truth and falsehood sort of is not eliminated, but if the proposition basically has to be made again for there to be true or false, right? I mean, we work from the functionality of, you don't have to go around and extend the proposition all the time to make sure that it's true or false. We take for granted that it will stay this same way. The conclusion will not change for the foreseeable future in which we plan to interact with the object. It's not going. If I want to get to my car, I'm not going to say that's a car, that's a car, that's a car, that's a car, to make sure that it's true, right? If I have a guy beside me or walk with my friend or something like that, right? Unless somebody, my pal beside me says, holy shit, the car is not, it's a false proposition now, I would say, whoa, what, right? So we are working implicitly from the axiom that when we state something to be true and agree upon it, it's like we won't make a proposition again until the proposition is no longer, compared to our subjective experience, is the opposite of what it previously was, right? If it was false and we did something together, well, until it changes to true, we're not going to make the proposition. But there's nothing that says just because we made the proposition that it must be true. So it's not the proposition itself. I'm just trying to point out that we have to be strict about how we explain this in order to make sure that the reader understands what we are saying, that they don't misinterpret what we say, so they have a different understanding than we're actually trying to present. And also that the reader doesn't get confused about what we actually mean when we say it in the text. So it's kind of confusing, the way this is put, in my opinion, right? Okay. However, if I see water drops on my window and I say that it is raining, that is a hypothesis. But raining is not something you can experience, right? Raining is an interpretation of something going on. At some point, you will classify an event as raining, right? If a few drops falls somewhere from the sky, you wouldn't call it raining because it's sort of an arbitrary attachment of, if there are a lot of water falling from the skies, you would just call it raining because it's sufficiently precise to make other people understand what you are talking about with them without them actually having to be there to experience it. That you don't have to, well, if it's a blizzard or something like that, or what's it called? Blizzard, that's a snowstorm, isn't it? and then what's it called when it's rainstorm? You would say rainstorm, then we say it's a more severe kind of rain or something like that, right? But there are certain categories, a few categories about rain. But generally, if you say it's raining, people would generally have an understanding of what you're talking about, even if they weren't there, right? You wouldn't have to point out that there are 7,800 drops of water falling a minute or something like that, right? That would be sort of too precise for it to make any sense. So we just have the term rain to describe a sufficiently strong kind of waterfall from the skies. But the rain is our interpretation, just like mammal is an interpretation. There are not mammals out there. There are objects out there which we have categorized as mammals. There are events out there, particular about water, which we classify as rain, right? So rain cannot be objective, right? It can't be objective. So he doesn't even understand basics. He doesn't even understand basics. And this is important, right? He doesn't understand basics. It's kind of unbelievable, isn't it? In my opinion. I'm just going to do a little thing here. So hang on, Sloopy. 1 second. And yeah, it's just give it a thought or two, right? And give me a comment below if you disagree with me. I think it's very, very poor philosophy, this, right? It's like he doesn't even attempt to think things through sort of meticulously. It's just throwing words left and right, calling this a hypothesis, and it's like and he's Mr. Give Me Definitions, right? From my recent deconstruction of his video about UPB, where he tells this guy who he doesn't allow to give his the opportunity to present his own arguments, tells him that he should bring the definitions and the quotes from the book, otherwise he should get the fuck out of here because he's a manipulative bastard, right? Something along those lines. He doesn't give any definitions of anything here, basically. Only very, very implicit definition, if at all, right? Okay. The failure to understand or act upon the difference between personal experience and objective hypotheses is catastrophic. Okay. The failure to understand or act upon the difference between personal experience. Can you act upon a difference? Understand or act upon the difference. Can you act upon a difference? Act upon, towards, apply yourself to the difference. Act upon could also mean that from this insight you're making some actions. If you're not acting upon the difference, but you're acting from insight into the difference, something like that. Okay. The difference between personal experience and objective hypotheses. Objective hypotheses. A hypothesis cannot be objective because that's an experience you have, right? And you not alone is an experience, it's an agreed upon experience with another individual, right? If you experience a cow or an elephant, if you experience an elephant, is that an objective hypothesis that it's an elephant? Right? You experience that elephant, and you experience that elephant. That's all you can say. I have that fucking experience of an elephant, right? You can get closer to the elephant and get sort of more, convince you more that you should be experiencing that elephant. But you can only say, I'm experiencing elephant, right? It has this color, it has this taste, it has this sound, and so on, right? You could maybe try to describe that. But you're experiencing elephant. What is an objective hypothesis about that? This fear of subjective experience is sort of permeating throughout his philosophy. It's like, no, I have to live in objectivity. And I have to be there, and I have to tell everybody that it's objective. And if you come and say something about your subjective experience, you're out to get me, right? It's a kind of paranoia almost, right? Okay, the chasm between feeling and proof is fertile ground for manipulative sophists. Okay, so now he brings in proof without any definition really of, as I say, feeling offended is the experience. Someone being offensive is a hypothesis that needs to be proved. So, hypothesis and objective hypothesis need to be proved. Why does it have to be proved? So it's a hypothesis. So when it's proved, it's objective. Is that it? So how do you prove a hypothesis? Do you go closer to the wet rock and, lick it or rub yourself against it and stare at it for 5 minutes or what? Until now it's proved, right? What? What is that? Okay, ideologists also spread this way. They primarily transmit themselves through emotions rather than reasoned arguments and evidence. Well, yeah. And that's why you bring in objectivity and honesty. You are also working from emotions, right? Between the lines, you are afraid of your own subjective experience not being taken seriously if you cannot relate to it as some kind of objectivity that people have to accept, right? You actually do not have any arguments, basically, in the way you frame your philosophy. If you can't, smash people with that hammer of objectivity. And that's at least a notion I get, right? But certainly, people would rather appeal to your emotions than making a strict, just a proposition. I mean, mostly my stance at the moment is that unless it's a pure philosophy or it's a strict proposition, it is sophistry, right? Unless it's pure philosophy or strict proposition, it's a sophistry. Because when you have your experience, right, and your objectification of your experience, you have your experience, the five qualia, sense qualia, right, and then your objectification of this experience, right, where your mind says that's an elephant. It's just sort of a collection of certain aspects of your experience which you call an elephant, right? Your mind objectifies as elephant. Everything in my experience here is objectified. Right? There's a sky, there's a cloud, there's a lawn, a fence, a tree, curtains, windows, chairs, table, a laptop, a lamp, my power supply. Finally, I remembered to put it in before I started, and my kitchen, and everything is objectified. That's just apparently how the world works, or the mind works, right? The awareness part, the one which is aware of my experience, right? That the objectification is possibly the awareness. So that's all there is. There is my experience and my objectification of that experience. That's all there is. Everything else in that which I call reality, or that part of reality I am experiencing now, you could say, I have the qualia and I have the objectification, and that's it, right? The rest is only something that is in me, right? My cognitive apparatus, my memories, my emotions, my feelings, my passions, and all that. It's all something that is inside me. I'm not experiencing my passion. Oh, look, that's my passion about, philosophy. Let me go and get my... It's not how it works, right? So when it makes sense to say that your experience is your window to the outside, and that outside you only have that experiential window access to. You do not know what is on sort of on the other side of that window, right? So the whole experience you have is inside you, and so it's sort of a simplified way of presenting it, so to make it simple to get to that understanding, right? but you're living in this internal 3D virtual reality, you could say, right? I'm not particularly fond of virtual reality because that's something else it's glasses and so it's not exactly the same I mean when I say virtual reality, because if it's virtual, you have no access to what it is in the real version of it, which is that thing in themselves, as Immanuel Kant says, you do not have access to, right? Okay, I'm going on a bit of a tangent here, I think, but yes. So what I have is, I can say I have colors, sounds, and so on, right? And then I have the objectifications, and I can say the sounds are not really the knowledge, the objectifications are the knowledge, right? It's not whether or not I experience gray that is interesting. It's whether or not that gray is a part of that area called elephant, for instance, right? That particular objectification called elephant. The elephant is important, not the color, on sound or the taste and so on. I mean, it's not unimportant in the sense that they are used to qualify your experience, your objectification, not identify or cognize, because the cognition is important for you to make certain actions according to that objectification. Fighting, fleeing, fucking, and feeding, right? But if you're going to eat the elephant, it might be a good idea to figure out whether it tastes good. You know what I mean, right? So it's not completely unimportant, but it's not knowledge as such. The knowledge is the elephant. The rest is, in my opinion, something that should have another label. Not knowledge, it's just some other label. Because knowledge is the deepest insight into your experience. It's, in a way you could say, it's the awareness part, or the I, or the me, trying to artificially step through that window and say, I think that if I classify this as an elephant, I'm actually closer to have something to act towards if I didn't do it, right? If it was just, a lot of colors and sound and so on, and I didn't objectify any of it, right? There wouldn't even be a reason for it to be there, right? It's only because I'm acting because of it that it keeps being there, because it will eventually turn into an action. Otherwise, why the hell would it be there, right? There must be some purpose. Maybe the purpose is not something I could get to, but at least I'm objectifying and acting accordingly, or in some understanding or another, right? And when what I was going for is that, okay, but then what I do really have that is important to propose or make statements about is my experience or my objectification, which is, that's an elephant, that's a bicycle, that's a cloud, that's a kitchen, so on, right? There isn't that much else you can say. Well, the kitchen is blue, but it's more important that it's a kitchen than that it's blue, right? So everything else is basically an attempt to provoke something else, that an objectification or an objective understanding of your individual objectifications, and trying to approach your manipulate it some other way, like appeal to your emotions or appeal to fear, here this whole sort of pandemic of this sickness that has apparently been around the world recently, right? It's just an appeal to fear. It's not an objectification. Nobody knows what the hell is going on, right? They're just trusting that whatever they're told is knowledge and it's science, right? So it's a trick. As a good philosopher, you say, well, you should treat it as if you're being manipulated, right? You should be treated, because you have no way of having that knowledge that you're supposed to have. It's not good enough that somebody comes and tells you, you should be afraid of this and do as you're told, right? That's not good philosophy. Okay. Next one is your own feelings, which are often highly susceptible to your perceptions. Since perception can very easily be wrong, what's a perception then? I thought perception was another word for experience. perception, is that your objectification then? If I'm saying that's an elephant, and I should not perceive it as an elephant, I should just be more critical of my perceptions. I don't exactly understand what he means here, right? Easily wrong? So what is wrong? Your senses are wrong, or your objectification? Is that your objectification? I'm just trying to figure out, align my terms with his terms, right? Assuming your feelings are mere reflection of perfectly accurate perception is a highly shaky stance to take and very dangerous should you prove to be wrong. Yeah, so it's while he's trying to establish, objectivity and senses, he's constantly, he is actually attempting to go around and manipulate your feelings, right? This is dangerous, and you should be careful, and it can be. He's manipulating your feelings. That's not pure philosophy. He is doing what he's saying is very dangerous, right? Manipulating feelings, and he's manipulating your feelings. I mean, oh my God. But then also at some point in my recent deconstruction of his UPB video, how to go mad or something, or go crazy. I don't exactly remember the title, something like that. He said, well, yeah, you should manipulate. I mean, sometimes it's okay to manipulate, but generally it's not okay to manipulate. Apparently this is where, when he says, well, you should be careful by people want to manipulate your emotions, and then he's proceeding to manipulate your emotions. It's very dangerous. It could be proved to be wrong. Be careful, right? It's sort of, okay, relax, man, relax. Let's do some philosophy and let me figure out myself whether it's dangerous, right? I'm not a stupid asshole who can't think for myself. And I guess that's your approach to your audiences. They're gotta be fucking stupid. I have to tell them that it's dangerous. They can't figure that out for themselves, right? Okay, the next part is called philosophy and subjectivity. So again, it's philosophy and subjectivity, right? And here it is, concepts and entities. What's the next one? Philosophy, discomfort and decisiveness. So it's always concepts and validity. It's always something and another thing compared, right? It's like he's always bringing in a third party that he can sort of attack while he's presenting his philosophy. So you are in that, yes, these bad people, we have to get them, right? And therefore, Stefan Molyneux must be right because he's against these people, and therefore I'm more prone to accept whatever he says because it fits my own personal agenda, right? It's just sophistry. It's just pure sophistry. This is not pure philosophy, right? It's kind of disgusting, right? I'm really off-put. It's off-putting to me, right? He's not appealing to sort of pure philosophy and inviting me into his thoughts. He is philosophizing from a distance and telling you this is how you should see it, and that is dangerous, and that is correct, and that is objective, and that is subjective, sort of like he's preaching from a stool or something like that, right? He's not saying, well, this is the way I think. When I think this way and I experience this way, this is how I would classify it and so on. You see how I'm going? That's not what you're reading. He's reading as if it's already settled and understood. He's just preaching it to you, right? Okay. Philosophy is the methodology that helps you determine the difference between subjective experiences and objective facts. Oh. Do I really have to, right? Philosophy is not a methodology, right? Philosophy is, you could say, that is the thing that creates a methodology, right? Methodology is something that is established using philosophy. That's what you could say, that philosophy is difficult because there exactly is no methodology to follow, right? You are making up your own methodology. It is not a methodology. It creates methods, right? Scientific method, for instance, is a kind of philosophy. It's not philosophy. It's not a method you use to create a method, right? There might be some potential bad avenues to follow down when you're philosophizing and you're sort of influenced by your confirmation bias and your preconceived ideas or whatever, right? But that's not in itself bad philosophy. The philosophy that arrives is influenced by things that shouldn't influence that philosophy you are doing, right? But I've also pointed out that when you are thinking philosophy, it's not the same as writing philosophy, right? So it's a big hurdle I have realized, right? Trying to write my own book on philosophy and ethics, which I'm doing at the moment, and I'm sort of, 1/4 through it or something like that, right? That it's not that easy going from philosophy to writing about philosophy, right? Your thinking of sometimes goes very fast, right? Sometimes very slow maybe, but it doesn't have the same metronome kind of approach as writing philosophy has. It has its ups and it has the pros and cons, right? The pros is that you are giving more thought to certain aspects that usually are passed through quite quickly when you're just thinking about it, right? And thereby you might find certain aspects that you might have jumped over a bit too quickly, right? The cons are that it can be very difficult to make sure that you get everything in there and that you use the correct terms and that you don't equivocate terms or equate terms, as I pointed out, because that is a big death nail in my approach to philosophy. It has to be as rigid, but it's difficult. It's freaking difficult because I tend to reiterate my writings again and again and again, and I might change a term here because I think this is a better term to use here, and forget that somewhere else in the text I use that term down there, but then I won't get to change that. And then when I get down reading that, and I get to, did I change that term or did I not change? So if you get my drift, you can get into a point where you have several terms for the same thing, but you have just from various timestamps within your writing process have changed it, but some of it might not have been edited to the new term used, right? So there's you have to be extremely strict when you write philosophy. Otherwise, it's just going to be crap, right? You might be able to write something that is sort of sufficiently coherent for people to understand sufficiently what you're talking about. But it's not going to be that really great if you can't take control of the terms and use them coherently throughout the book, right? And this also have to do with this thing that I'm very concerned about, which is the reduction. When you define things and use axioms and so on, it's actually your approach to your reduction base, which is the lowest level you can get to, which in my opinion are the qualia, right? And when you establish that, sort of you work from there and build your philosophy, so to say. The reduction base, or the things you add to on top of the reduction base, have to be defined. If you say that you have to build a bicycle, and then you say that the wheels must be put there, and then a week later you call them the walls instead of the wheels, then people would get confused. Why are they called walls? Are they the same as the wheels, or is it a different kind of thing that is similar to wheels but the same as wheels? So why not just call it wheels all the way through your manual of how to make a bicycle? That's the kind of same approach I'm taking in philosophy. At first, when you define something and this is what it's called, I am using that term throughout the philosophy to make sure that people understand or get used to understanding. You have sort of a tight connection between thinking and explaining, right? And Yes, it has to be very, very well thought through, right? This is so far from any kind of treatise of philosophy that you could possibly almost get, right? It's very, very lightly written. I'm not even sure what the correct term is, right? Okay. We need philosophy precisely because mistaking our subjective. Well, this we thing, why don't you talk for yourself, right? If you say, I need philosophy precisely because mistaking my subjective experience for objective fact is so easy. So, but you cannot say we need philosophy. Yeah, okay, if you mean that every single individual should do some philosophy on his own or on her own, right? Yeah, I understand what you mean, but we need philosophy. It's almost like you're appealing to some authority. I mean, it's sort of, it might be interpreted that way, right? This collective term we is, in my opinion, one of the most dangerous words you can ever use in a text, right? A tree cannot be incorrect. Sunlight cannot be erroneous. Water cannot take a wrong turn. And fungus cannot be immoral. A tree cannot be incorrect. It's just, it's an annoying way of, his way of arguing is exceedingly annoying to me, right? A tree cannot be incorrect. It's almost like he's having this sort of half joking, sort of half sarcastic, or sort of, he's certainly not trying to be deliberately making pure philosophy. He likes to be a little sort of cryptic in his way of writing, right? That's also a bit of, it's a side effect of sophist notions that sort of a tree cannot be incorrect, sunlight cannot be erroneous, and so on, right? It's just like, don't write it that way, man. Come on, man. Truth and falsehood. Is that called something called truthhood? You may enlighten me. I'm not, a superb English-speaking guy. Is there something called truthhood? Is that called telling the truth? And falsehood is like good and evil kind of approach to true and false. I don't like that. True and false are both very important. They are at least equally important for judging or comparing a proposition to your experience, right? If somebody says that's an elephant and I don't experience elephant where that elephant is supposed to be experienced according to the proposition, well, I'm going to say it's fucking false. Or even I'm going to say, well, see you next week or something like that, right? I'm going crazy, right? Then false is as important as true, right? If I'm telling the truth, I'm being truthful by saying it's false, right? I would be lying if I say it's true, right? So it's kind of, truth is a state that results when a concept matches. Okay, this is gotta be important, right? Truth is a state that results when a concept matches an entity or a hypothesis matches the facts. Why does there have to be an or in there, right? Don't lump two things together at once. It's like, you always have to bring, it's this or it is this, right? Truth is a state, so it's something in your mind. It's not something out there, right? It's not a part of his reality or his objectivity. So truth can't be objective. That's settled now. It's a state that results when a concept matches. So it's when it's a state that it's true. So if a concept matches an entity, what's an entity? Matches when a concept matches an entity or a hypothesis matches the facts of reality. Oh man. It's like this is what is freaking important, right? And I can't understand this unless I try a deep deconstruction of it, right? Maybe I should do that the next time. Take this to the cleaners, right? And deep dive deconstruct. The truth is a state that results when a concept matches an entity or a hypothesis matches the facts of reality. So it's a hypothesis can be true, and a concept matching an entity is true. A concept can be true, and a hypothesis can be true. Well, the last part, the hypothesis, a hypothesis cannot be true, right? Because if it's something is true, it's no longer a hypothesis, in my opinion, right? I don't say I have a hypothesis that this is a glass of juice, right? It's a glass of orange juice. It's not a hypothesis, right? It was like saying it's sort of not really settled yet whether or not it's knowledge to me. So I'm going to have to wait until it's matching the facts of reality. What's the fact of reality then? It's still just my glass of orange juice, right? Where I'm going for that, where do I find the fact in reality that make me say, aha, so this is true? No, I have my fucking experience of my glass of orange juice, right? And that's it. I have that experience, and it's enough for me to do this. Right? It's enough to do that, right? But what is it a hypothesis that this is a glass of orange juice? When does it become a true? Because I have to apparently match it with the facts of reality. But it's a fact to me that this is an orange juice, right? A glass of orange juice. That's reality to me, right? I can't go somewhere else and look for okay, wait a minute, I have to check with reality. I'm going to look at my phone and, looking at, okay, I'm checking reality. Yes, this is a glass of orange juice. That's not how things work, right? You have the experience. This is the orange juice. It's the same orange juice which I brought to the table here before I started recording. I'm convinced of that. Somebody might have come and changed it into some arsenic or something without my knowing it, right? I can't have that, but to the best of my understanding, my experience, this is the fact, which is the orange juice. I'm actually experiencing, my experience is the fact. This is my reality. I'm not comparing this to anything. I'm only having access to my reality, right? I'm not comparing this to anything. Right? At most I could compare it to, well, it's the same juice that I brought here in the past, right? That past I no longer have access to. It's only a memory or an idea of time gone by or something like that, right? But that's not the experience in the now. I can't verify the past in any empirical way. It's only a memory, right? It's only a memory. So what I can compare it to is my memory, but that is not objective, right? The object is this one. It's not the memory that I compare it to potentially that can say, okay, therefore it's knowledge, right? Or therefore it's true, right? So it makes, and this is just an example of how bad things get if you don't get your metaphysics right. And it's one of these points where bad philosophy tends to get more and more complicated as you go along, right? While good philosophy, in my opinion, gets from being quite complicated to be simpler and simpler until, a moral principle basically jumps out of it, right? And my approach seems to be contrary to any other, because all the philosophers I've been listening to the last 10 years, it seems that they can make it. It seems like they think that unless it is very difficult, there must be something wrong. So I can only believe that I'm on the right path if it's very complicated, right? Because philosophy is so complicated that you need to study it for 10 years to get a PhD or something like that, right? Bullshit. It's just using your brain. It's just using your thought, your thinking, right? It shouldn't be that complicated, right? And if it's very complicated, in my opinion, one should say to oneself, thinking, I'm doing something wrong somewhere. It can't be that complicated, right? Because if I'm going about my everyday, and it feels like I can almost do that on an autopilot. It depends on your personality, right? I'm more of a thoughtful guy, maybe, right, than most people in general. But I'm also on autopilot and wake up and brush my teeth and take a bath and make a coffee and go to work or drive my car or get my groceries. There's a lot of things that are just sort of autopilot because there's no other better way to do it, right? It might only be small adjustments. And if philosophy is something you have to study deep, complicated books for years and years and years to even have a grasp of what might be going on, right? It's like if you have a bicycle, right? And people can ride a bicycle. And if you are going to write a manual on how to ride a bicycle, it would be like, a one-pager, right? You could write it on one page in your word processor, right? It wouldn't take 8 years of studying books for the 3,000 written during the last 3,000 years by very intelligent people, possibly, right? To understand how to ride a fucking bicycle. And the same goes for making food, and the same goes for putting on your clothes, and the same goes for everything in most every part of your life. And that's the part of life that has to be regulated by some kind of morality. Now, why would the manual for figuring out how to make that adjustment of your quite simple everyday life be so incredibly complicated? It doesn't make sense, does it, right? It's like if you bought a bicycle and then you get a manual on 5,000, tightly written pages that told you how to ride that bicycle. You would say, what? I need to put my ass on the saddle and then, keep the balance and then make the pedals go round. That's basically, and then move the steer left or right, depending on where I want to go, right? It doesn't take, 5,000 pages to do that. And none of your everyday life needs a manual larger than one page. And these 100 things that you do in everyday life, it could possibly fit on 10 or 20 pages. And then you would have a manual for describing you most of your everyday life. Then why the hell must the thinking about adjusting these things, right? Because if a moral principle is applied to bicycling, it shouldn't be a very complicated procedure, because what could it possibly be? Moving your pedals a little slower, a little faster, moving your ass a bit on the saddle and twisting the steer a little this way instead of that way. It's small adjustments. That is the difference between morality and immorality. Then why the hell is it so complicated to figure it out? I'm just not buying it, right? It should be quite simple. I'm not saying it should be like a walk in the park. You have to get down to, metaphysics and so on, right? But again, I think that mostly philosophy has become so complicated because people have the belief that it must be complicated, because people haven't figured it out yet how to approach like knowledge, right? It must be because it's very, very, very difficult and very, very, very complicated. And you need to write very, very, very long books that deals with every kind of philosophy in the last 3,000 years. You are dealt a little with epistemology. And then everybody just gets confused on a higher plane. And the next guy who writes a book, there's another complicated book in the annals about epistemology. And then he thinks it's even more complicated than I thought. And it has to be even more complicated, right? And now it's so complicated that nobody can figure anything out, right? Just take something like metaethics, right? It's absolutely ridiculous. It's ridiculous, right? It's so blown out of the water. It's like, who the hell can use that for anything other than make people even more confused than they already are, right? So it's just my rant on philosophy in general. It's just so incredibly complicated, unnecessarily complicated, and I don't accept that it has to be that way, because it has to work with an everyday that is generally quite simple. Yeah, I know if you're going to make a new iPhone or something like that, it's not just a walk in the park and then the next day you have an iPhone. But it's not like it would take you 3,000 years and reading hundreds of philosophers to figure it out. You just, work on it and then done, right? Okay. Truth is a state that results when a concept. Okay, and then we'll take this one. Truth always refers to concepts or language and the degree to which they match what exists and occurs in objective reality. Okay, so I think I might take a deep dive on this the next time, if I remember it, right? So, if I point at a mug and say it is a telephone, we cannot fix my statement by replacing the mug with a telephone. But why would you say that it's a telephone, right? If I'm sitting beside you and you point to my mug here, right, a coffee mug, that's a telephone, I would say, what? That's not a telephone, that's my coffee mug, right? And if you kept, no, that's a telephone, right? I would say, but what's the matter with you, right? I said, that's a telephone. No, that's a coffee mug. You see, there's coffee tasted, right? And then, no, it's a telephone. I said, are you crazy? Right? I will call 911 something like that. What is that to fix? I can't tell the guy that, well, you are not experiencing telephone, right? I can't tell him that because I don't have access to his experience. You should understand that. You don't have access to other people's experience, right? Because you are inside your own experience. And what you have access to is your own experience. You can't experience potential external experiences, right? So if another person says that's telephone and you experience it as a coffee mug, you're just disagreeing about objective reality, right? You can't go and tell that person you should experience what I experience, because maybe it is a telephone and you're just experiencing wrong. But I wouldn't, I wouldn't fall for any kind of, gaslighting trick. I would stay with my experience, say, no, I experienced that coffee cup. Yeah, you might think it's a telephone, but to me, this is a coffee cup, and you're not going to change my stance just by, trying to manipulate me, because I can't know whether or not he's lying. So I have to approach this as a lack of possibility of getting objectivity about that particular object. Well, if I'm sitting in front, that guy's sitting in front of me over there on that chair, right? And we're looking at the table in the middle, there's this cup or this mug, and that we seem to be looking at, both of us. I would say it's fucking crazy, right? And I will say, well, maybe we should call it a day and see you some other day, right? And then sort of kind of ghost the guy, right? Because I would consider him crazy, right? But I can't tell him that he's wrong. I simply can't do it because I don't have access to his experience. For that reason alone, right? There is no intrinsic objective reality, because all attempts at understanding that, now I'm calling that external world reality. So I'm mixing the words a bit here, right? But if we call that external world reality, then somebody has to start experiencing before we can make any kind of reference to it, right? So why would my experience be superior to somebody else's experience? That's a kind of arrogance. And that we need to get away from that, right? So if we agree on that coffee mug, fine, let's kick into drinking coffee, right? I bring in another mug, right? And then we agree on that mug, right? So it's like, but if somebody says it's a telephone, I would say, are you sure? Well, yeah, it looks like a telephone to me. Okay, right, okay, fine. I'm not going to tell you what you should think. I'm just going to treat it as a coffee mug, right? and maybe not invite him next time, right? We cannot fix my statement by replacing the mug with a telephone. If I call the mug a telephone, I am incorrect. Why? How do you know that you're incorrect? You know if you are experiencing a coffee mug and you call it a telephone, you are wrongfully objectifying or proposing that object according to your experience. But only you have access to whether or not it's an incorrect proposition or a kind of falsehood. If you could say a falsehood could maybe be when you're proposing something that is not in accordance with your experience. That's falsehood. When you say, wow, that's a telephone, right? And you know you're experiencing a coffee mug, then you are deliberately falsifying, making a proposition you know is inherently false to compared to your experience. That could be a kind of falsehood maybe, right? Because my word does not match what I'm pointing at. No, that's incorrect. But the point is, you're the only one who knows that it's incorrect. As I said before, that other guy sitting over there would say, well, you're fucking crazy, right? But he wouldn't be able to tell me that I am not experiencing telephone, right? He would only say, well, I don't experience telephone. I think you're fucking crazy, right? Fine, that's his subjective judgment of the situation, right? If you're looking out in the distance on the African savannah, you see something moving down there, and I say, I think it's an elephant, right? I am experiencing elephant. And the other guys, what's it called, narrows his eyes and look that way and puts on his glasses. Say, I'm not sure. I think it's a coffee mug, right? And we would be sufficiently sort of, yeah, well, let's get closer to make sure or something like that. But if we are sitting at the table here and unless you are sort of blind, you wouldn't dismiss. You should be able to objectify a coffee mug correctly if there's a coffee mug. But you can only say, well, my experience is a coffee mug. Okay, I'm beating this horse to death, right? But it's just this rejection of subjectivity that is going to destroy his philosophy. I mean, it's absolutely certain, right? He can't get that extra check that he wants so badly to have. He's going to say, yeah, but I'm going out to objective reality. I'm going to check, and I'll come back to tell you this is a coffee mug because I've been out there in reality and checked, and it is a coffee mug, right? No, you only have your subjective experience, and you need to stay with that. The standard of truth refers not only to the relationship between concept and objects, but also to concepts about the relationship between objects, such as gravity or magnetism. None of these are true, right? These are not things that can be true. Gravity can't be true. It's an explanation. It's a method. It's a methodology. It's a principle or a formula, right? It's not something that is true. Okay. I've been here before in my deconstruction. So if I say that gravity repels, then I'm incorrect. My language does not match the true relationship between mass and gravity. If I say that magnetism can pull down a tree, then I'm equally incorrect. Magnetism can pull down a tree. The relationship between concepts in the mind and matter or energy in the world is the relationship referred to as truth. Okay, this truth thing is a notoriously difficult thing for him to define. I've actually made 8 months ago. I made a video about Stefan Molyneux' various definitions of truth. And it doesn't really hang that well together, right? You're more confused after his explanation of truth rather than enlightened, right? And here is sort of all sorts of, okay, truth is a state that results when concept matches an entity or a hypothesis matches the facts of reality. Then truth always refers to concept, language, or degree to which they match, they exist and occurs in objective reality. Okay. The standard of truth refers not only to the relationship between the objects, but also to concepts about the relationship between objects such as gravity and magnetism. Okay, the relationship between our concepts in the mind and matter and energy in the world is the relationship we refer to as truth. It's like, oh man. Okay, let me present my idea of truth very clearly and see if you find that a more simple and understandable way of approaching truth than he does, right? I experience elephant, right? I point to that object and I'm making a proposition about that object my mind has objectified because I want to transmit it to somebody else. If I was sitting alone on an island, I wouldn't make propositions because there was nobody here to listen to them, right? Why would I make a truth or potential false statement? Because nobody's there to listen. And I already have the experience of the elephant. I don't need to make the proposition in order to figure out whether or not I'm experiencing that elephant. But because I do not experience somebody else's experience or have access to their experience, in order for us to figure out whether or not we agree upon the elephant, I'm not saying that I have to make a proposition to validate my experience. I'm saying that the reason I make the proposition is to make an agreement or get an agreement upon that object with another individual, at least one other individual. So truth is or false, truth or false, these are both the two sides of the same coin, right? If I make a proposition, then if you can maybe even make it more, truth is when your experience matches, is identity. The truth is when the concept part of your experience matches the concept part of the proposition. In other words, if there's a proposition that says, and somebody pointing, that's an elephant, then truth is if you experience an elephant in that exact same place where it's apparently is supposed to exist, according to that one making the proposition. So truth is if you have an experience that matches that proposition. Truth is when your experience matches the proposition. That's all. Then it's true. It might as well be false, right? If somebody says that's an elephant and you look in that direction and see there's no elephant, then it's false. That's equally important. But truth is when your experience matches a proposition. That's all. That's all there is. You don't need these relationships between concepts and mind and matter and energy and the world and, concepts and objects and relationships between gravity and magnetism. And, it's all like, oh my fucking God, I'm even more confused about truth now, right? No, truth is when your experience matches a proposition. That's it. When your experience matches a proposition, it doesn't have to you making the proposition, right? But if somebody makes a proposition and says that's an elephant, if you experience elephant, it's true. If you don't experience elephant, it's false. That's it. That's all. It's so simple. It's so fucking simple. If you get your metaphysics right. Okay, let's see concepts and entities in the next part. So we are in 1 hour and 14 minutes.